Starting in 3, 2, 1. Darkness, more than anything else, is the home of despair. On our side of the house, we give people a lighthouse, a way they can shine the path so they can get out of depression, get out of trauma, and find a path to a better life. 3 things in the speech. First, characterization about why trauma plots are likely to be done relatively well. Second, catharsis and awareness for people who need it the most. And third, how these trauma plots affect people without trauma and cause them to be better allies. First, what do we defend? We think, to be charitable, that there are both good and bad trauma plots out there. But in a competitive media landscape, the best trauma plots rise to the top. First, the people who direct and greenlight these projects, that is, the authors of these books, are likely people who have gone through trauma themselves, for the very reason that much of fiction is autobiographical. It is much more authentic to draw on your own experiences as a survivor of suicide or sexual assault when writing about these topics, compared to somebody who hasn't engaged in these issues in the past. So you have authentic incentives to do this well. Second, there are natural checkbacks and profit incentives. If you want your TV show to be renewed for another season, then you better make sure it doesn't fall victim to societal critique. Third, these things can improve over time. This is the unique benefit of prominence. If there are many trauma plots instead of just a few indie projects, you can pick and choose the best trauma plot. You can elevate it through things like discussion boards and rankings, and these things become much more beneficial when you have prominence in a wide, diverse ecosystem. Fourth is self-selection. That is, these shows are likely to appeal to specific niches. Euphoria, for instance, talks about the experiences of people in high school specifically, and how young people engage with mental health. Because shows are specialized, they likely cater to a specific niche and are not generally about all people with mental health problems, but rather about the specific problems one group faces. Finally, multifaceted stories just are more interesting. This is the reason why Colleen Hoover is dismissed as trashy, but a complex character like BoJack is elevated and gets Emmys. Sure, Anders.
Yeah, people care a lot about sexual assault and have experienced it. Probably will write about it on the other side. When it's very prominent, so there's massive financial incentives, people who don't have any experience still write about it and do it badly.
The problem is that these books never get past the publisher because there's no profit incentive. If these books are unsuccessful, if they're only sold at the indie bookstore, then, Penguin Press has no reason to start, running the presses for this book. First argument, we get more catharsis and awareness for people who need it at the most. At the individual level, we provide victims of trauma a way out. First, why do people feel alone and scared right now? Trivially, the world sucks for a lot of people. 1/3 of women will be victims of sexual assault in their lifetime, in addition to being under the boot of capitalism, or people who are just victims of trauma in general, from their romantic partners, from their parents, from their friends. Then, we think there's a double harm to forcing these people to grapple with this trauma unaided over time. That is, because this is traumatic, people are unlikely to share about these events, which means in society, there's a dearth of public discourse. Nobody wants to talk about their personal problems, because doing so is seen as embarrassing and too vulnerable. Then, why do they turn to trauma plots? Why do they watch these kinds of shows? First, it's a much lower burden than things like going to therapy, which isn't available in much of the developing world. 3/5 of the world lives in Asia, where norms of therapy are much weaker. And it's less stigmatized when these shows are popular. So I probably don't watch Euphoria if it's just 10 people on the internet watching it. But if my friends are watching Euphoria, I'm much more likely to turn to these shows and be aware that they exist in the first place. And third, when these shows are more prominent, my pre-existing interest also incentivized me to watch these shows. So maybe I really like Billie Eilish, and the prominence of these shows allows Billie Eilish to make a song about this kind of issue, which is why I am exposed to these narratives. So prominence is necessary. Third, why do trauma plots uniquely solve for the kinds of problems I outlined at the top? First, it just normalizes these problems. That is, you see other people who are like yourself, which you are disproportionately unlikely to see in the absence of these plots in, the popular discourse. They might say, social media or something else solves. First, note that if it is true that short-form media is the devil, then I think the short-form media they get on their side is much worse, insofar as you don't have longer novels or TV shows, a complex character development. Instead, all you have is rat-a-tat-tat TikTok reels feeding your brain with very simplistic notions of mental health. Second, many of these shows have solution-oriented plot lines, for the simple reason that it's impossible to keep a 300-page novel or a 6-season show going off of sadness alone. If all that happens is the characters take drugs, hook up with each other, and feel sad, then people probably aren't going to watch them. Which is why even really pessimistic movies like Perks of the Wallfower or shows like BoJack Horseman end up with happy endings or moments of happiness interspersed. So it makes you feel like this isn't permanent, this is something you can get out of, and encourages you to take similar steps, like for instance, going to therapy or talking with your friends about these things. Third, it creates infrastructure through awareness. Things like Logic's song, which has the suicide hotline number as the title, incentivizes awareness of the resources that are already out there and makes you more likely to turn to them. The endpoint of this argument is first, that people feel much better in the immediate term, and second, that they're more likely to take an optimistic view that gives them a route out. Why is this better than the re-traumatization claim we get from OG? First, it's just much more unique. People face sources of re-traumatization every day. I can see an image of the person who traumatized me, or just somebody who reminds me of them. I can feel the pressure of having to work like an 11-hour job. And on their side of the house, there's no way of turning those things off. Life doesn't have an off button, but social media and television do. You can block accounts that aren't helping you. You can close the book that you're reading if it makes you feel bad. So at best, we give you some risk of getting, or at worst, we give you some risk of getting better without any risk of harm on their side, because people just can opt out. Second argument, how do these trauma plots affect people around you? We think that there are three important contributions. First, it fosters dialogue in communities. I think the counterfactual they defend is one where trauma plots still exist in some extent, but they're just much more minimized. That is, they are the side which shoehorns a suicide into a TV show, which is otherwise about something else entirely. On our side, we defend shows which are mainly about trauma itself, mainly about the trauma that drives these plots. Then, on our side of the house, we incentivize more dialogue. That is, more people are talking about mental health when it is the main event of a show rather than a side plot. Second, bystanders and allies learn how they can treat you better. That is, they see that these are real problems. So the first step is legitimation. That is, people really suffer because of this. Man, I wish you had told me about this earlier. But now that I know what you're going through and I see how it can affect you, I want to step in and do something to help. And second, they're more literate when they do make these attempts to help. They see what works and what doesn't on the screen in a laboratory that doesn't affect any real people. So when they come to you, they're less likely to say something offensive. Third and finally, even if these shows are really bad on their side of the house, like 13 Reasons Why, for instance, and glorify things like suicide, this creates positive pressure and discourse against those kinds of things. 13 Reasons Why was widely panned by critics and led to things like schools and governments condemning the show because of the way it glorified suicide. The endpoint of this argument is we create better discourse around things like mental health and better support systems, which are incredibly important because fighting trauma isn't something you can do alone. You necessarily rely on friends and others. Proud to oppose.
There are countless war movies, but what turned the tide in the Syrian refugee crisis is the real photo of the child who drowned on the beach. The issue is, in the age of social media, there is plenty of spotlight on sexual assault in these cases when there's the Me Too movement, when Malala is outspoken about sexual abuse in her country, when news reports confirmation hearings in which Anita Hill stands up and checks out about sexual assault. We do see these figures in their empowerment. We do see how they're brave, they told their stories. We do see the donations linked on social media when charities link all of these help to these platforms. The difference is this. On their side, what we see is fictional characters who still fit the plot of a story, and those solutions are therefore unrealistic. But the difference is also this. On their side, they might have more discourse in quantity, but the discourse is happening when families are watching this movie while sipping on Coke and eating popcorn and joking with each other about a day out. On our side of the house, when you know these are real people, when the stakes are high, when that's what you see on Google engines, people handle this discourse with much more sensitivity and realisticness, and that conversation that they crowd out is the reason why they lose this round. 3 things in this speech. First of all, I'm going to tell you why they get more bad portrayals. Second of all, harming trauma victims. And lastly, why they've heard real case proceedings that exist. Firstly, on the why the portrayal is bad when it's prominent, the only response we get is a very mandatory one, that there's both bad and good responses on either side of the house. But what we're saying is, when it's prominent, when the quantity increases, that's when the bad portrayals go up. Because that's when companies say, look, this seems like a moneymaker, seems like a winner, let's add a portion of this into our plot, even if no one on the creative team is personally attached or has experienced assault. When the baseline is not discussed in movies and media, then only those who have personal stakes or feel like they are certain they can take this risk, because I'm confident I can tell this story well, will portray these stories, so they get more bad portrayals, they have to defend that. Checkbacks is the other thing they say. But this is existing on either side of the house when social media will call out bad portrayals. The difference is this, when it's oversaturated, it is really hard. Has anyone watched all the movies on Netflix? And that's the reason why they can't have discussions around all the bad movies that exist, whereas if there are only a few movies, then we can pull out the bad ones, and even if it's a few good movies that also still exist on our side, all the things about empathy, if it works, still exist on our side of the house as well. This is the reason why they have to defend more bad portrayals, and also as told you, why bad portrayals harm victims, because it trivializes the experience and mystifying defines it and defines the narrative. Second of all, let's talk about harming trauma victims. Number one, I think exposure is bad regardless of the quality of portrayal, because if you can't avoid it every corner you turn, that's when you feel like you're boxed in by your traumatic experience that exists. The issue is, on their side, they also have to defend a sensationalization of trauma, because it has to fit a movie's plot of a hero's journey going up and down. It has to have tense music to increase the stakes for audience members, and that's when you elevate all the feelings of anxiety and fear when you're watching these clips with a trauma victim. The mere exposure is really bad. But let's see what they say about trauma victims. They say it's going to be catharsis, because you're going to see these people empowering themselves. They're stuck in a double bind here, because if it's cathartic, because the female will rise up and defeat her perpetrator, then that fits into the problem we're talking about, which is movies tend to have a happy ending, because that's how you bring a degree of satisfaction. In reality, it is really, really hard for victims to stand up and overcome their trauma when it's like a really huge fear that exists in their life, and all the structures doubt them and question them. So if they have happy endings, then they give victims self-blame, because it's supposed to be really easy. Just take these steps and you will succeed, when in reality it is very, very difficult, and victims doubt themselves. They also feel inadequate in these ways. If it's really realistic, and therefore it's really hard for victims to fix these problems, then you disempower them even further, and you portray how women are really weak and they're trapped by trauma, and you stick them into this trope. They're stuck in a double bind when they talk about catharsis. Let's move on to the next part, about reaching out to friends for help. Because their argument here is that when there's more discussions, your friends will handle them more sensitively. But the issue is, they might have really insensitive discourse, because when your friends are talking about a movie on the subject of sexual assault, it is still in the category of entertainment and pastime. What do I mean? They might think they really respect sexual assault, but given it is a movie or a rom-com, they might say that plot was so cliche. Oh my gosh, the plot twist was so predictable, the acting levels were so bad. The issue is, when you have a personal stake in the movie, those criticisms sound personal to you as well, because you're you're dismissing, you're trivializing, and you're poking fun at the subject that I take very seriously, because I'm a trauma victim. This deters me from going to you for help, because I think you have this tendency to trivialize my concerns. But if it is true that they get catharsis because they have happy endings for these victims, then I think your friends will give you terrible advice as well, because when they are saturated with this arc of how you empower yourself, they'll tell you, just do this, just go to these authorities and do that. They won't seriously listen to your concerns, because the premise is it's really hard to deal with a sexual assault, and they won't be humble in respecting you and listening to your circumstances and trusting you've thought through all of these things. This is really important this round. Systemic change from art is really, really hard. It might help a little bit, it might harm a little bit, whatever. But the exposure and the insensitive conversations about the movies hurts victims every day when they're saturated by it and surrounded by it. And this is something that triggers a lot of pain for people who've gone through this process. This is why this argument is important. But next, I'm going to zoom out a bit bigger and talk to you about why we hurt policy making and hurt case proceedings as well. Before that, I'll take a point from closing. Opening.
The stuff you do at the top about why sexual assault is always in the news is a death knell for your side, because it proves the re-traumatization is non-unique and you're always going to be triggered again.
No, but we have more realistic solutions, and we have people who've really gone through sexual assault talking on Twitter, so they know how to say it sensitively, because they have lived experience, not fictional characters. The difference is you have it on your side when we search up sexual assault, and the news is not what first pops up. News based on real people who tell their real stories and lived experiences, versus on your side, like the entertainment and gossip news and like all the things about Blake Lively comes up first. Moving on to why it hurts real case proceedings. This is important. Trauma victims in movies is not the same as trauma victims in real life. Movies have dramatic plot twists, whereas in a day-to-day, trauma is not something that's that theatrical. It is daily, it is through very, very small verbal abuses. It might be someone you know, not someone who like appears out of the street and like pushes you into a corner and do something really bad. But also because movies have clear lines. These characters have well thought through logic. They have a whole team honing the lines in which what you say, but real victims suffering through PTSD, they're not the ones who are calling everything correctly. They might have gaps in memories or inconsistencies in what they say. The issue is when there's prominence, when I'm a jury member adjudicating a case on sexual assault, what pops into my mind is this character of a person who's a sexual assault victim who speaks perfectly, who speaks consistently, and whose tone doesn't fluctuate at all, and knows her story airtight, because that's what movies have when these lines are well thought out. We don't see the real news figures who do have these gaps in memories, like Anita Hill, who are overwhelmed by emotions in hearings, but are still very, very credible because she does go through these experiences. This is the reason why it's better on our side. Because for voters who are adjudicating like a congressional hearing about whether or not Brett Kavanaugh should really be on the Supreme Court, or for juries that are adjudicating these cases, we would rather them have a real victim pop up in their head so they can forgive the imperfectness of victims and still believe in their stories. Look, victim blaming probably will still exist on either side. We're not claiming that everyone will suddenly become an ally. But what we're saying is in individual case proceedings, juries can believe you so much more easily if what pops into their head is not this perfectly curated character who looks a particular way, who's probably beautiful and white, who speaks so flawlessly and effortlessly on their side of the house. For all these reasons, so proud to propose.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. When I was faced with deep bouts of anxiety and sadness in high school, very often I wasn't able to identify these kinds of things. I didn't open up my phone to look for social media creators who could relate to me on an everyday basis. I only realized these things when I started watching BoJack Horseman, when I saw the development of a character who faced very similar to things that I had on an everyday basis. You could also be someone, right, who feels deeply depressed, and you only realize there is a tool out when your favorite celebrity releases a song that has the numbers of the suicide hotline in their title. The point being that very oftentimes, these deeply traumatic experiences are only realized when you have fictional characters and vehicles that people turn to on an everyday basis, rather than the social media they talk about on their side of the house, which is often symmetric on both sides of the house. The issue with their side is that they're just deeply uncomparative. Why does their fictional characters argument not work? The first reason is because, obviously, as they characterize themselves, there's an inherent trade-off between short-term content and long-term content. People will turn to these things for the same reason. That is, if people are turning to things like TikTok or Instagram Reels or social media for catharsis from their everyday life, to get a break from their everyday existence, it is unclear to me how, number one, they want to engage with deeply traumatic storylines, but number two, also, how those storylines are able to achieve the same amount of depth on their side of the house, and that is very, very crucial. Second, there's obviously a causation problem. That is, these narratives only get thrust to the spotlight when you do normalize these kinds of issues, which are often far easier when you use the vehicle of fictional stories, because very oftentimes victims are scared to be the first one to come out and scared to be the first one to share their stories in the first place. So we actually create the kinds of discourse that they want on their side of the house. And the final thing that I would say here is that just very oftentimes we do get deeper catharsis on our side of the house, even if it is the case that you can look at social media. Very oftentimes these things work in tandem. They don't really prove uniqueness on their side of the house. I want to quickly weigh our attention then, because I think we can actually fight the trade-off. We can agree, maybe some bad forms of content are released on our side of the house, but we think that for every single person who is able to watch something that they identify with and they believe in, that this depth and level of catharsis is both deeper and both unique. And the reason for this is that traumatization and triggers that they want to talk about on their side of the house are actually not that unique, given that they tell you themselves this comes from everyday experiences, your coworkers that you meet on an everyday basis. And furthermore, even if it were the case that these things were somewhat traumatizing, for the same reason people on their side of the house have the optionality to look at social media, we also get the optionality for people to have agency. But on their side of the house, you never create these forms of discourse and media in the first place. You never have the choice to watch things if those media and books and movies and songs just simply do not exist. That is why we can cleanly win this clash on our side of the house. The second way in which we win outright is just because we actually decrease the very stereotypes that they want to talk about. I want to quickly just give an example, right? Because obviously, the more that you create kinds of media, the more that this media is able to be diverse. The more that you greenlight indie projects, because the risk of these projects failing decreases. The more that, for instance, that you're able to fund like animations and diverse movies and not just relegate them to side plots, the more and more that these things tend to improve over time. Whereas on their side of the house, the very stigmas that exist, the implicit biases that people exist, are just those of 50 years ago, are just those of 90s TV shows where the wife gets verbally abused by her husband and doesn't really do anything and just becomes really sad. So even if it were the case that on their side, some people have negative stereotypes reinforced, we don't think that this is a unique impact, because as long as we can prove that some of those biased people tend to watch good forms of media and tend to have good incentives because their friends turn to them and say, this is how I'm feeling, you should watch this and listen to me, then we can actually access a far larger margin, because these people go and help their friends, these people go and instantiate and make change. Yes?
If you don't know how sexual assault looks, then you're far more likely to listen to your friend when they give you their portrayal, whereas on your side, you already have a background.
The whole point is, number one, the friend very oftentimes doesn't have the tool to speak out about these kinds of things, and number two, it is very difficult, which is why it is far easier to show them a piece of media to be able to express these kinds of things. Next, I want to explain why prominence is actually needed for good content, because it is the burden of OG to prove why this good content existed in the first place and why there was visibility. Why do I think that why do I specifically think that prominence is the reason why you get better content? The first is the Overton window, right? It just is the case that the more content you produce, the more that the public becomes willing to engage with these kinds of things. So for each bad movie that you put out, or bad TV show that you put out, the discourse that is created around it makes the next subsequent iteration a lot better. The second is because there is safety in numbers. That is, people only feel good about speaking out, and movie studios only feel good about greenlighting movies when it is the case that there are empirical examples of these succeeding in the past. And thirdly, we just think that there is we think that there's more of an ability to have competitive mechanisms like media and critic discourse, which is the reason why you obviously have an incentive to showcase diverse narratives, and it wouldn't just be that white woman that they talk about on their side of the house. Because when it is the case that these things become popular, then when movies about white women already exist in the counterfactual, that's the unique impetus for why you create movies about brown women or Asian women or black women, because without the prominence, then obviously the only movies that you greenlight are the ones that are going to be mainstream successes, that are going to be massive box office hits, because they rely on the implicit biases that already exist in the status quo. The next thing that I want to talk about is this argument about triggers and why I just do not think it is unique and actually gets far worse on their side of the house. Because their argument is that Google search has an incentive to spotlight the most harmful narratives and make these things really bad. But the first response that I would have to this is that algorithms are actually incredibly good at sorting for what people actually want to see, and we think the more content that you give people to react to, the more that these algorithms are able to actually show them the good kind of content that exists in the first place. But second, the more that these things become popularized, the more that you enable subsequent amounts of backlash to actually provide trigger warnings, right? To call for greater instantiated amounts of change, which does not happen in the absence of popularization, because it just becomes the case that the kinds of voices that are likely to speak out about these things get sidelined, and also the mainstream news does not have an incentive, for instance, to report on things like Colleen Hoover's book being incredibly problematic, and it just becomes the case then that the people who seek out these kinds of things do not understand why they can be deeply triggering and why they can be deeply harmful to the counterfactual. The final thing that I want to touch on is why your friends just become a lot better at engaging with these kinds of things. Because I just do think it is the case that in the absence of the popularization, the average person just has no incentive to engage with problems that are not proximate to them and they do not care about. So even if it's the case that these narratives are somewhat flawed, we think that having a basic understanding of depression or anxiety as shown through these TV shows is obviously better than no engagement at all, and makes you a more supportive person, makes you donate to a charity, and makes you want to help out your friend. Very, very proud to oppose.
Here, here.
The problem with trauma plot lines is that when you have a high amount of saturation, the ones that show the most amount of trauma being inflicted on a person, the ones that show the hardest times in rehab, the most struggles you have to overcome are likely to be the most popular, and I think that this is extremely damaging both for addicts and people who need to get help. It extremely is harmful to the recovery process, but I also think that it reinforces narratives that other people have about how their children probably aren't addicts because what they're facing is really not that bad, and it doesn't live up to what they see in media, etc. What we're going to do on closing government is a few things. First, some refutation to OO, and then explaining why we think that the way that trauma plots occur is very damaging for the recovery process that many people face, is extremely damaging to them being able to recognize that they have an addiction, and we're going to weigh this against our top half. Quickly dealing with OO, I'm going to flash more on this later, but I just want to flag a few things. The first thing is that I think a lot of the therapy benefits they talk to you about are relatively assertive. I'm unsure how watching a TV show that maybe shows someone overcoming domestic abuse is going to be all therapeutic to your own situation or helpful. I don't think it actually is probably going to give you any tools that you can use to get out of your situation. It's not going to help you learn how to ask people for help in your unique shoes, etc. I think that these shows are often not generalizable to people's lived experiences. But the second thing is, I think a lot of resources that exist in media are very, very lip servicey. So for example, a song title having the National Suicide Helpline is really probably not that helpful. I know that song very well. It was all over the radio. Could not tell you what the number is. I think on top of that, shows that 13 Reasons Why, having to put a disclaimer at the end that's here's the crisis helpline you should call in the credits is not helpful whatsoever for most people. I think that their characterization is just very, very idealistic and bad. I think at best you get lip service on their side that media companies throw together at low cost to cover their asses. Finally, I want to move on. No, thank you. To why I think it is that you have depictions on media that show the max amount of tumultuousness or the max amount of struggle, even in the best cases, so even in inspirational stories of people overcoming their addictions. Why is that? First, note that it is both emotionally gripping and attention-grabbing to show lots and lots of, for example, failed attempts at rehab. Because for every time you go and you relapse, the stakes are raised for that character, and I think that audiences connect with it more. They become more emotionally connected because they want to see this person finally succeed. For every time you see, for example, an abuser get away with it or police handle them improperly, you become more outraged at that character and more enraptured by the story. I think that oftentimes the stories that show the most amount of struggle are the ones that get the most attention. They hook people in emotionally and make them want to watch. And I think this is especially true in like a competitive media market where you probably have lots of different shows showing different levels of trauma. I think that having the most emotionally gripping narratives are probably what media companies have incentives to do. And note that this is true even if you have the most well-informed addicts themselves or people who are victims themselves making these stories. The second thing is, note that for plot reasons, it is probably just likely that you don't have like cases being shown where characters maybe have drug issues in season 1 and then are clean for like the next 5 seasons, right? You look at shows like House, the most boring episodes are the ones where he's on methadone. If you look at a series like Dope Sick, we stop hearing about the characters as soon as they recover, and we move on to other stories because it's just kind of boring to watch someone like make their way through life successfully. When instead you could see immense amounts of trauma. I think that this is because characters don't have as much erratic behavior, for example, when they're clean as composed, or as compared to like when they're in the throes of addiction, etc. I think that you don't have the same level of uncertainty that makes people keep wanting to watch if they successfully overcome things, which means that for the duration of a lot of this media, you're going to see people in the throes of active addiction. You're going to see them dealing with the worst parts of their trauma. You're going to see police departments turn away victims of sexual assault, etc. But the third thing is, I think that oftentimes having the most sensationalization or the most bad stuff happen in a story is very, very good for producing like chatter and discourse, right? Like think about books like A Little Life, where everyone's talking point about this book is, can you believe how much terrible stuff happens to this character? That's literally the reason why this book is so famous, right? This is also the same for truthfulness. So this also deals with awe. Because if it's true that you can point to a story like Beautiful Boy and say that this was based on someone's actual life, what had actually happened, I think that this generates more discourse and like attention for these stories, and I also think people actually believe that they are real or that they're applicable in more cases, which is bad. What does this look like then? I think this looks like people are like, showing neglectful police officers where victims of domestic violence or sexual abuse go to these police stations and they're turned away or have their stories delegitimized. I think this looks like people going to rehab facilities that are like state funded, for example, and being surrounded by, extremely traumatic experiences, people who are like harassing them, people who seem to be dangerous, etc. Depicting these treatments in a very bad way, and also showing constant relapses, constant re-traumatization, etc. Before I go on, I'll take opening.
I think as a Canadian, you might know this, Logic's song is the reason Canada recently adopted a suicide hotline 119 number that makes it much easier for people to call. Calls to the hotline spiked after Logic's song.
Okay, that was maybe like 5 years ago. Thanks, moving on. Thanks. Okay. I think this is harmful for a few reasons. I think the first is that note that addiction and sexual violence and grief are extremely, extremely hard things to overcome, and making this process look very terrible and difficult to accomplish is actively discouraging to people. Because if you're in the throes of active addiction and you make rehab seem even worse, make it seem like it's extremely likely that you're going to relapse because that's what the dominant media characterization is, you're just less likely to seek out support in the first place if you think that your odds of failure are very high, or like this is going to be a terrible process. The second thing is, I think that oftentimes people who are in active addiction or who are trying to overcome sexual violence have reasons to doubt themselves. Note that it's extremely hard to accept that you have a problem. It's extremely hard to accept that something bad happened to you, and I think that this actually reinforces the narrative where people see, for example, like alcoholics on television shows doing very, very bad things and think, well, I'm not that bad. I didn't get wasted at my sister's wedding, whatever, and make a fool of myself, so probably I'm okay relative to what I see in media, and I think that that's bad. But finally, I think that other people use this to help cast doubt on addiction or on trauma of people in their lives. Because, for example, your parents are probably going to be slightly skeptical or not want to believe that you have an addiction because they view it as a failure on their own behalf. And if they can say, well, you're not as bad as all these other addicts whose true stories we can point to because we've seen them in media, that is a mechanism by which your trauma is avoided and the process of seeking out rehabilitation is delayed for you. I think that first of all, OG's case relies on an idealized characterization of media, showing perfect victims, or portraying this in bad ways for their harms to flow, whereas we say that even if you have very realistic depictions, this is bad. But I think finally, we say that this is not just triggering for victims, it actually prevents them from seeking out assistance and overcoming their traumas proud to
Opening government is correct that there's probably a lot of articles that get written about the opioid crisis or about abuse or various forms of trauma on their side. The question is, do people engage with it, do they care about it, or does anything happen? First extension that closing opposition will provide in this debate is why specifically the forms of media that the trauma plot compose are uniquely valuable tools for communicating why you should care about these kinds of problems and why they actually exist. So let's extend far further than opening opposition to say things like it normalizes it and it points to resources, which might be useful things, but we think don't really get at the heart of the argument. The first thing we want to know is that the utility of the trauma plot as a device is that it's far more likely to cover new and cutting-edge forms of abuse, or forms of abuse that aren't currently in the public eye, and get them into the public eye. And note that yes, it's true that counterfactually someone might write an article in the New York Times, which no one will read on their side, but when you put it in a TV show or a movie, people are far more likely to see it. The reason for that is one, there's obviously an incentive towards novelty, because you want to stand out. Secondly, often these people are going for prestige kinds of awards, like you want to win, film awards, you want to get an Oscar, etc., which often pushes you towards particularly cutting edge, or particularly highbrow forms of analysis there, which explains why you're often going to make art. And finally, because victims are often involved, as opening opposition points out, and other teams can see in the debate, often they want to share forms of experience that aren't yet in the public eye, and that is why you're likely to see new forms of abuse. Secondly, though, the tool of, for example, film or television is uniquely useful for explaining what the problem is. So that is to say, one feature of depression might be that you suffer from brain fog and you find it difficult to concentrate. It's much easier to convey that by, for example, use of focused camera angles or use of sound design than it is, for example, just write an article that explains what this is and why you should care about it. But think about how, for example, people know that PTSD exists. It's been around since World War I, but being able to communicate the experience of having a panic attack is uniquely useful when you can use film, when you can show, for example, the blurring coming in around you, or the sound rushing into your ears, and how it makes it so much harder to focus, or makes it so much harder to actually engage with what is around you. But thirdly, it's useful because it creates a sense of narrative that cannot exist in the counterfactual examples that opening government wants to, and closing government want to talk about. Firstly, for the reason that half of the examples they want to point to are non-fiction, but secondly, for the reason that obviously when there is far less prominence, you get less airtime, which means less capacity to do that narrative, but secondly, you also just care less about the kind of content you pump out. Like if it's a peripheral part of your piece of media, it gets the least attention. Why is that narrative important? Because it means that you can have a character you can identify with, you can see yourself in them, you can conceptualize with them, and watch as the trauma unfolds. The reason that is important is one of the big problems for victims of trauma is coming to terms with the fact that something has in fact happened to them in the first place. If you're, for example, a victim of child sexual abuse, you're very unlikely to know that you're a victim of child sexual abuse, because often it happens when you're young, because often the person who has abused you has incentives to, for example, tell you that nothing is wrong, to cover it up, to try and pretend that it never occurred. Often you have incentives to play it down, because they're like a member of your family or someone you know well. You don't want to think of them that way. You don't want to engage. It's only when you have the narrative and you can watch it play out, you can realize, holy shit, that happened to me. I was a victim. And that is what allows people to actually understand that trauma has occurred to them. And that is logically prior to anything that other teams in the debate say, because they just assume you'll sort of watch it and then, they assume that step has already occurred, but it is not. Similarly, think about something like stealthing, which is, in many jurisdictions not a crime, in many jurisdictions is, but people often lack awareness about those kinds of things. Those are things that we can uniquely plug. Finally though, fourthly though, often you can demonstrate a sense of connection to character. This is important because often people in an academic sense know that mental illness is a thing, but there's a broad perception that it's all a bit fake, right? People are lingering, people are kind of making it up. It's not really that bad. So being able to actually watch the effects unfold over a character, see how, for example, the diagnosis or the trauma occurring to them means that their life changes or alters, or they're unable to do things they want to do before, or it affects their relationships, or it affects the way that they engage with other people, is unique and useful because that's what makes people care. That's what makes people believe this might be real, this might be something I need to care about. Finally though, in many instances, in the absence of the predominance of the trauma plot, discussions of trauma occur in collective rather than individualized fashions. Why is that important? Because you get a movie, for example, about the AIDS crisis and how bad it is for scientists solving it, but you never connect with the individual, and that is what makes you care. That is what humanizes those victims, that is what gives dignity to them. As Stalin said, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic, and the comparative that government defends all too often is statistics that no one gives a shit about. Yes?
I could explore other niche forms of trauma as an example, or, hear me out, slap in sci-fi comedic elements, hire a superstar like Zendaya or Sydney, or just do a killer marketing campaign. This is less risky and more profitable.
Yet the difference is, when it's prominent, as we explained, makes up a larger part of a particular piece of media, which means that, for example, you have more nuance you can explore. But secondly, it also means that you give more attention to it because it's not peripheral to that discussion. It also means that there is more of it, which means it's more likely we get discussions of new forms. So even if you believe there's lots of bad stuff, the value of the new stuff that covers uncharted territories, like discussing things like financial abuse, that, for example, might not be very commonly discussed, is very high for those marginal beneficiaries. And like the bad stuff, just kind of like, there's a lot of bad media out there. It's unclear what 2, 3 more, or a million more pieces of it really does in this debate. Second extension is on victims. Firstly, we'll explain why victims can obviously opt out of engagement, which is take out open government. And secondly, we'll explain uniquely why this is good for victims, because they're often artists, and artists benefit a lot by this trend. Firstly, why can you opt out? Firstly, because if it's prominent, it's going to be clear it's about trauma in the first place, so you can just not watch it. Secondly, there are often trigger warnings for reasons that you don't, like you want to be helpful to people. Thirdly, there's often discourse around it, like this team says there's social media about these kinds of things, which explains why you know what it's about, why you can just choose not to discuss it, not engage with it. And fourthly, obviously, like to the extent that you're getting triggered by social media or gossip, as opening opposition points out, you're just going to get triggered on either side, nothing really changes. Why is it good for artists? Firstly, why is it often the case that artists are themselves victims? Poison government gives us one reason, they're the most motivated to create this art, and opening opportunity gives us the other, you want authenticity. So that explains why this premise is true. Why is that useful? It gives 4 benefits to these groups. The first one is it allows them to share their experience, which is often the most useful way to get catharsis, the most useful way to get over that trauma. Secondly, it allows them to get money, acclaim, status. Those things are good. They're able to turn something negative, something awful that happened to them, into something positive that happened to them. Thirdly, it allows them to externalize the issue. So for example, if you're being a victim of sexual assault, being able to do art that identifies the difference between your body and yourself can be very useful in coping with that trauma and understanding what has occurred to you. But fourthly, it allows you to be a part of social change. If that thing that happened to you defines you and is the worst thing in your life, being able to push back against it and effectively say, this happened to me, this is bad, we should stop it, and be the change that makes people care about, be the change that makes people understand it, that is the most valuable thing that a victim can do. That is the most valuable thing in the debate. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
I think that there are some ways in which O is right. In some cases, victims do opt into consuming media that they think reflects their experiences. But uniquely, Sarenna tells you that in many of those cases, that media gives them the wrong advice. It says, you will fail if you go to therapy. You will fail if you go to rehab. It is not worth you doing those things. The police will not believe you. The result is victims are far more likely to suffer in silence, and they're far less likely to pursue the aid that they need to pursue. That's the largest margin of debate, or at least larger than any of the top 5 margins. I'll explain why CO is wrong about their case. First of all, then, a few responses to CO. They say that you're able to portray the problems in ways that are rather nuanced, and so as a result, you're able to recognize more when things like sexual assault have happened. This is clearly wrong, because Sarenna's already given you reasons why you have an incentive to portray these types of things in the most extreme ways possible. Because that makes for good material. It means that you can stand out on social media. It means that when there's clips of your show, people realize and think that the show's more entertaining than you have rather nuanced, rather subtle portrayals that talk a lot about what therapy feels like. The net result is that people are far less likely to realize that they've been assaulted, or far less likely to realize that, for example, they're an alcoholic, because they think that the standard for those things is much higher. Second response, I think that there are other types of activism that allow types of education that are probably going to happen to some extent on our side of the house. So this looks like people in schools being taught about childhood sexual assault, educators being told to watch out for signs of sexual abuse, etc. I think that could exist, but to the extent that people see a lot of narratives that contradict it, and I think that those narratives are more recent and more common in people's lives, I think they're more likely to believe those narratives that are often worse. Lastly, I just think that artists are often actively exploited doing this process. So this looks like actors, for example, being forced to film sex scenes that make them incredibly uncomfortable. This is far more likely than in other type of media because the sex scenes themselves are meant to be degrading, or meant to be uncomfortable, and I think as a result, probably this is actively bad for artists. Let's then explain what closing government gives you and why I think it's round-winning. We explain that oftentimes there's selection for repeated failures, for things like extremely bad portrayals of therapy, etc. People are likely to believe this because actors oftentimes have an incentive to portray their shows as realistic. So when you go and interview shows, because it generates some public approval if you say it's realistic, even if it's not, actors are often incentivized to do so. Then a result of this is I think that there's a large margin to the extent that people are likely to see rehab much worse. I just want to analyze to you that the average person does not know what rehab looks like. The average person has not been to rehab, they haven't consumed that much media about rehab other than this, so they're particularly likely to believe what they see. That means that they're far less likely to do things like access rehab if they think that it's not going to be effective. And I want to explain that rehab and things like therapy are the most important. First of all, because they're backed by a massive amount of scientific research, but in many cases, they just have resources that you cannot get clean without. So things like substitute drugs for those who are chemically addicted are critical for allowing them to get over things like heroin addictions. So the result is that I think that this is a far more effective process than the things that open government and open opposition talk about, which is like maybe you can talk with friends or relate to people in shows, or for example, you can be re-traumatized or not. I think the far larger margin is the ability to pursue medically effective and research treatment, and how that's far more likely on our side of the house. But we also think that you're far more likely to do things like report things to police if the perception is that the police are going to take you seriously and do things about that. That means that you're far more likely to get reports, you're far more likely to be able to eject people from spaces, put people in jail, which I explain is the largest margin because it means that they're far less likely to have future sexual assault. So people will be traumatized in the first place, and that's far larger margin than, for example, having mild amounts of help by talking with your friends. This is also accessible to everyone. Note that people everywhere in the world are able to report things to police. And there's lots of government-funded therapy programs in many parts of the developed world, so this is applicable to lots of people. Okay, let's explain then, I think, why we weigh over opening government. I want to point out that opening government's margins in the best case scenario is that some people are re-traumatized and some people may talk to their friends in ways that are not very beneficial. I just think that this is far smaller because those people are far less likely to do things like massively solve their problems or have a huge amount of treatment to the extent that like talking with your friends probably don't know that well how to deal with this, and even if they watch shows for opening opposition, they're probably not going to get that much better. It's then quite unclear why I think, it's then quite unclear for opening government how much they're actually able to help victims. I also think that to the extent that we explain that victims are less likely to be affected in the first place because we can jail more people, there are more reports. And I also want to note that to the extent that you have more reports, you're more likely to be able to jail people, not just because you have one person reports and then have to follow and have to enter your standard. You're more likely to get multiple victims coming forward, which means that you're more likely to get like far more witnesses for things like court cases, etc. I also want to point out that shows oftentimes portray things like the court process as particularly negative and particularly difficult. So because they want to have things like a sequence of a victim on a stand getting cross-examined by a prosecutor in ways that are incredibly uncomfortable, that means that they're likely to portray these things this way. The average person also doesn't know how the court process works, so they're far less likely to be able to, for example, feel comfortable coming forward and talking to a prosecutor or feel comfortable talking to the police to the extent that they think the process will make them very uncomfortable and will be very unpleasant for them. Okay, on opening opposition then, a few claims. First of all, I want to point out that all of this stuff about how the market is going to solve, because you have more volume of this, is dependent on the market caring about things like realism in ways that actually are effective. We explain that this is unlikely for a few reasons. One, things like artificial complexity, things like moral grayness, and unnecessary conflict oftentimes make the market more profitable. But we think that longer running shows are more likely to generate artificial conflict because once you resolve the first season, you need a second, third, fourth, and fifth season. The result then is I think the market actually solves for things like being incredibly egregious, incredibly grotesque, rather than having rather accurate portrayals. They also have a claim on how social media solves this type of thing. I just want to point out that as Sarenna says, first of all, controversy is oftentimes what sells, so if you have more conversation about something, social media oftentimes that's actually beneficial for the thing. But second of all, look, the DLO actually themselves says this. Many people don't access social media content about their own trauma. Many people don't want to read about that online, and so their only source is watching things like BoJack Horseman, which we explain is quite bad. So what this then means is that they're unlikely to resolve to have the corrective mechanisms that they want. I'll take opening.
CG derives the worst part of OG sensationalization claim. Both creators and audiences have demand for solution-oriented narratives, and police are much likely to dismiss you on your side when they have no experience with mental health.
Yeah, so that's just not true. First of all, there's like intuition check. All of the Oscar-winning films that you see have like really morally great endings. BoJack Horseman is just a complete lie. Like oftentimes these are actually quite negative endings. But additionally, we think that even if there's some eventual solution, oftentimes it is after a huge amount of traumatization to do with the therapy process, which means that it's far less likely. Also, this claim is definitely new from OG. OG just doesn't talk about resolving your trauma at all. We explain why that's something that's uniquely bad. Okay. Lastly, on conversations, and I think that this is something that op-ed broadly relies on to try to mitigate our harms. I think, first of all, it is quite unlikely that those, for example, you're close to that have been sexually assaulted themselves come forward to tell you when you're wrong. So if you watch Euphoria with a friend and they've been sexually assaulted, to the extent that they already don't feel comfortable, it is unclear why they're going to feel comfortable now correcting you. This means that oftentimes, if you have, for example, conversations with your friends, those conversations are themselves harmful to the extent that they're informed by bad things, and then they don't come forward and tell you, which means that you also harm your friends. Also, the reach of these conversations is much smaller. Even if there are things on social media and editorials, most people who watch Euphoria don't watch those. Their advertising budget of the New York Times is like way smaller than a massive TV show, so most people just don't get exposed to this type of thing. Lastly, we think that conversations are oftentimes dominated by major social media figures who don't have personal stake in this and don't actually know. And the result is that victims are far less likely to seek types of help that are helpful. So proud to be close.
There are two questions today. First is about victims, the second is about the way society reacts to and treats those victims. On both questions is our extensions of decisively biblical. Let's first discuss victims. The first time I may respond to is that of opening up. We say these plots are likely to trivialize trauma, and I know here CG is obviously not this claim. Though we remove this claim from debate in four regards. Firstly, opening government do not prove these plots are likely to be trivialized. Firstly, the info slide all but requires these plots to not be very trivialized. The info slide explicitly states that these plots are likely to be aggressive. These plots are likely to be portrayed in ways that are quite extreme. Obviously, it can't be that trivialized or it wouldn't be in the info slide. Secondly, there are mechanisms for why it would be trivialized by law. Firstly, they say there's a trend towards short-form content, but obviously the delta is based on that TikTok, and things like maybe episodes in particular of Netflix shows are short, but they can be multiple episodes, which is something they can trigger over a long term. Second claim they say is, well, you need to follow a trope. But firstly, they explain themselves in Jackie speaks that these tropes are unconvincing, or tropes are not very persuasive, which explains why they're unlikely to be tropes that exist into the long term. But secondly, very few tropes say that we should treat people that are abusers, people that cause trauma, with the same kinds of empathy they require those tropes to treat with, for the reason that would be unconvincing, for the reason it would preempt backlash. The third claim they make is there's oversaturation, but then in response to my POI, they rebut it and explain that there is not in fact this saturation, and saturation does not produce that response. The second problem with opening government is that they rely on there being non-prominent forms of the discussion of trauma that then can backfill it. The problem is that there are no non-prominent forms of the depiction of this trauma for multiple reasons. Firstly, without this depiction of trauma, there would be on the alternative a stigma of the discussion of trauma in media. Because if no one in the mainstream is doing it, no one in the mainstream is talking about it, it is unable to be compelling, it's something that people don't have purchase depicting. But secondly, for the reason that artists are unable to survive producing the kinds of media they want them to produce. That is, they want artists to produce media that is likely to be not seen by multiple people, not prominent, not something the rest of society considers important or useful medium. That means there's enormously unlikely people watching it to get revenue, nor is it likely to be an enormous amount of state funding. Because unlike on our side, where the state often considers these things that are worth funding, artists don't get the funding on their side. The third problem with opening government is just that they rely on there not being that many people watching these shows, because definitionally the shows can't be that prominent. In which case, the benefit they can claim of people watching the non-trivialized version of shows is necessarily small, is necessarily only a few set of people are watching it. The final thing we explain is the benefit to artists, and that is our extension, which is that the people that benefit from that trivialization are far less important and far less numerous than the artists that are able to make material just cohesively about their experiences. First thing I'll note is why artists are the most important parts of this debate. Firstly, they're by far most affected by this motion. That is, as everyone else agrees in this debate, this is just a pathway for other victims to access their ways to resolve their trauma. Everyone just wants them to call the suicide hotline. What we talk about is a set of people that are directly affected by this debate, whose mechanism of coping with their trauma is removed. But secondly, the reason is that artists' trauma is intersectional, because overwhelmingly it is an underpaid industry. The artists who are suffering in this debate are likely the ones who don't have the money to go to therapy, the money to sort out their problems in other regards. We explain those artists are able to share their experiences, they're able to access money and power and focus, they're able to externalize their experiences onto other things, for instance by making media that treats the body as separate from the soul, and fourthly, they're able to feel like they're promoting social change, which gives them a sense of agency against forces of traumatization that are often so inexorable that most people feel like they're nothing to change about it. There are two responses to this claim from that government whip speech. Firstly, they explain that their extension resolves this claim. There are two problems with the extension. Firstly, it's obviously not. Prime Minister spends 6 minutes of their speech explaining it's likely to be super trivial, and then government member is like, no, it's not trivial, it's really serious. Like, these things are obviously intention. But secondly, the narrative they describe is obviously not real. Like the narrative that, oh, well, people watch a show, the show is really extreme, so like all forms of this trauma are extreme. If your form of trauma is not this extreme, it is not real. That is not a thing anyone believes. Firstly, everyone knows that fiction is extreme, everyone knows that fiction tells stories in more extreme ways. But secondly, the most important sections of this debate often have traumas that are far more extreme than that depicted in TV. TV has all sorts of licensing requirements, all sorts of restrictions on what you can ultimately depict on television. The trauma people face is far more pernicious than that, far more harmful. Second claim they make is they say, well, artists might get degraded by having to do sex scenes they don't want to do. Firstly, this isn't what responding to our extension, it's just another claim. Secondly, it relies on a knife, which is more extreme. They cannot argue that it is more extreme. Thirdly, artists generally have choice and generally the ability to engage in this in ways they would like to, for the reason that the industry has developed relatively good standards, because of all of the backlash that we've had to shows that have treated artists in ways that force them to sexualize themselves, force their bodies to be harmed. Obviously, that claim is unlikely to land. So, that explains that on victims, the most important set, the set that's most uniquely affected by this debate, are the ones that are artists, and that's where we're going to debate. Okay.
BoJack came out over a decade ago. Because it was a fresh show in an unsaturated market, Netflix was less hands-on, and it was spoken about far more. In a saturated market, more people are talking about Justin Baldoni's lawsuit than the actual fucking movie.
Okay, in which case there wouldn't be prominent, so that clearly can't be the set for the debate you're arguing about, right? Like we're arguing in the context where it's prominent. You just talked about the context where it might be prominent, not about the debate. Second part of this speech, let's talk about the way society responds to those victims. I'm going to here differentiate between our analysis, which is about whether society cares about victims, and opening opposition's analysis, which is about whether society is aware that those problems exist. Our analysis is more important for a series of reasons. Firstly, in order to get change, you need people to care a lot about an issue. You ask a lot of people when you ask them to criminalize things, when you ask them to spend money or vote in ways that productively resolve issues. You ask a lot of your friends when you ask your friends to support you during enormous amounts of trauma, when you ask your co-workers to make up for you when you are depressed. You need people to understand a lot how traumatic these things are. Second reason to weigh us over opening opposition is there are many other sources of the things they describe. There are many other ways to make people aware of the base facts of these crimes, as is pointed out on the government bench. What is unique is the ability to make people understand and feel what that is like. Thirdly, it's just unclear whether the benefits open government gets are very valuable for the reason that they get your friends to care more about helping you and be aware of it. But if people are friends with you, they already know it is an issue because they've already spent time talking with you about it. What's far more important is convincing the rest of society. So, we explain you're able to access, firstly, the medium of sound design that helps people feel what it is like to experience these traumas. Secondly, the medium of a narrative, which is far more compelling than that of non-fiction. Thirdly, the medium of talking about people as if they're an individual, rather than collectivizing them in ways that often depersonalizes their trauma, as most British films do about the HIV crisis. Not a single one of those mechanisms gets response from government with. Secondly, though, I will note, we also win the clash of awareness with two mechanisms. First, we explain that we access newer forms of traumas. That is, traumas that are not discussed. Things like stealthing, which are often not seen as crimes in certain jurisdictions, are far more capable of being depicted on our side than on their side. And secondly, we explain that we give the victims that are most vulnerable in the debate, the victims that don't yet know that a crime has occurred to them, they don't yet know that they've been abused. No, you didn't say it. They don't yet know that they've been abused. They give them the language to talk about it, the language to describe it, the language to tell police officers what their trauma has. So perhaps opening government can talk about the efficacy of court cases once they're won, but obviously they can do jury selection, which resolves their quibble. These cases are far more likely to be brought under our side, so people identify when abuses have been perpetrated onto them. And that is the most important thing. Very much.